Now, tonight's speaker is currently the Charles Kline Professor of History and Management at Hillsdale. He's a frequent columnist in various publications writing about free market economics and limited government. He's also a guest on numerous radio and TV programs, such as the Michael Medved Show and Fox TV's Fox and Friends. He was one of the first historians to show how FDR's economic policies did severe damage to the economy. Keynesian economics were especially upset with his book, New Deal or Raw Deal, accusing him of misinformation about FDR. Imagine that. They especially did not like to see the comments of then Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau in 1939, notations in his diary, where he was complaining about these policies. Morgenthau wrote, quote, "We have tried spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. And I have just one interest, and if I'm wrong, somebody else can have my job. I want to see this company prosperous. I want to see people get a job. I want to see people get enough to eat. We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot." What, does that sound familiar? Well, he took a lot of heat for that, so he had to refute these unfounded allegations by citing chapter and verse of the diary and the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York. So he got a little bit of notoriety with that book. Tonight's talk, which he's written with his charming wife, Anita Folsom, who's with us tonight, going to offer some examples in their latest book, Uncle Sam Can't Count, on how feel-good projects always fail. The book is scheduled for national release on August the 15th, but we were able to negotiate having some copies here for purchase and for autograph over there at the end of the program. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Burt Folsom.
Thank you, Jerry. Let me get this off. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for inviting me back. We had fun the last time, and we're going to have some fun tonight. And I want to thank Jerry. I want to thank the Friends of Hillsdale College who are here tonight in abundance. And Jackie Linnebrink, who is the staff person most responsible for getting this working from the Hillsdale end. And I thank Jerry and all that have helped with the Conservative Forum here at Silicon Valley, getting the two groups here together so that we can talk amongst each other and know that we're not alone. And I tell you what, we've got this subject about failed government subsidies. Anita and I wrote this book, Uncle Sam Can't Count, which is a history of failed government subsidies that goes back 200 plus years. I regret to say this, starting with George Washington, culminating, of course, in the current Obama administration. And I appreciate Anita for co-authoring this book with me. And we looked at this whole issue. We thought when we came here in April, we thought it's a shame the book is coming out April 15th on tax day. Convenient. And I thought we won't have it here for the forum. And we were talking with the publisher, and we're saying, well, it's a group of friends of Hillsdale College and the Conservative Forum, and they're from California, and they're sensible people. And the publisher said, let's get them the books. And so we were able, I've not had this done before with the book that I've done. We have it here 2 weeks before it is officially published. Thank you, Jerry. And we have that available, if you'd like, at the end. And I see them over there. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about the book. Talk a little bit about Uncle Sam Can't Count. And the whole idea of failed government subsidies. After all, farm subsidies have been a disaster but they've only been here 80 years. Our welfare program, unfortunately, has also been incredibly counterproductive, but it's also been here for 80 years. I see. Would you like it right here?
There you go, that's good.
I see. We're going to give me... I'm hooked up. That way, if I say something wrong in the forum here, the jolt of electricity comes. And there's suspicion that I may be doing a lot of that tonight. Okay, so that's a good idea. Right here? Does that help?
Yes.
It's not brushing? Thank you. Thank you. What I want to do in getting at this, 80 years for welfare that's failed, 80 years for farm subsidies. Our founders desperately tried to stop these failed government subsidies from ever starting because Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, as you may know, has a very limited role for the federal government. The idea of having subsidies to start some company to produce a product that we might need was something the founders didn't want. They made the assumption that empowers government and is dangerous to freedom. You have this idea, for example, in the 1800s you might want a better rifle, a better musket, a better rifle. The idea, well, maybe we should just have this fellow who seems to know what he's doing, give him a subsidy and have him do it. That idea was no, we don't know if he can really do the job. It's picking favorites, winners and losers. We don't know if it's a good idea. The founders agreed with this. The Constitution, a very narrow restriction for what federal aid can be used for. And the amazing thing is, a wonderful president, and George Washington was a great president, he got the idea we have to have a subsidy to a federal company in the fur trade to stop the British from coming in and encroaching on our land. Well, come to find out, we've got this federal fur company, and the British are encroaching right where the fur company is. And we have private fur traders that seem to be more effective with the Indians in doing the fur trade. And so we eventually abolished the fur company. We think, well, gosh, that's an example of kind of a failed enterprise. And then we started again with steamships, some of whom were bringing people over here to California to settle after the gold rush. And you get a major technology like that. When we talk about this, we have chapters on the fur trade, chapter on steamships, and the idea, it's a story of people. It's a story of entrepreneurs. There are many heroes here as well as kind of villains who take the federal aid and do not produce a good product. We see that in the steamship industry, where you have a guy named Edward Collins who receives the federal aid. And Collins says, well, I've got the federal aid, and he's charging these incredibly high prices with the federal aid, and you have private companies charging less. Collins builds his ships of wood, even though other people are starting to innovate with iron hulls. No, we're going to go with wood. It's expensive. He crashes half of his fleet, literally, hitting icebergs. Some of it got lost in the ocean, never recovered. And then we have Cornelius Vanderbilt. Becomes the first American to be worth $100 million. He does it by charging substantially less than was charged by the government company. He did it with no federal aid, discounted rates, and full ships, back and forth across the Atlantic, and then over around here to California too. We had to stop there at Panama and Nicaragua, where we kind of take these railroad journeys across and then go to the Pacific and take them all the way to California. That was the strategy that Vanderbilt had. Ends up being a successful company. You know, why? It makes you wonder. But we thought, well, it failed. But when the Californians said, we want to be connected with the Union more explicitly, a transcontinental railroad is the strategy. How many studied the Transcontinental Railroad when you were in school? How many studied that it took a lot of federal aid? Let's put it this way. The national debt in 1860, the whole national federal debt was $60 million. That's why they call it the good old days. And we paid 60, did I say 60,000? 60 million. $60 million. Abraham Lincoln said this Transcontinental Railroad is so important that we're going to spend $60 million in subsidies for the Union Pacific and Central Pacific. The railroad was crooked. The railroad was built incorrectly up high grades on the mountains. The railroad was virtually non-functional in many parts of the country. It was a disaster, and the Union Pacific went broke several times. We're pulling our hair out with all those federal subsidies that went into it. Finally, an immigrant named James J. Hill comes along and builds a transcontinental railroad from St. Paul, Minnesota to Seattle, Washington, without 1 cent of federal aid. And that railroad never goes broke, and it's considered by many the best functioning railroad in the nation. Wow. The only transcontinental railroad never to go broke, and the only transcontinental railroad never to receive federal subsidies of any kind. And so we get these lessons in our history. And you think, well, why didn't we learn? Well, that was such a disaster, we did learn for a while. One of the exciting things after the Civil War, we had 28 straight years of having budget surpluses annually in the federal budget for 28 straight years in this country. We cut 2/3 of the national debt off, and we avoided government subsidies. That's part of the secret to it. And it makes you wonder, if we were so successful doing that, how did we ever get out of that good habit? The answer? The airplane. A new technology again, like the transcontinentals or the steamships. A new technology, the idea we have to help it along with government aid. Well, here's the logic. Because a lot of people said, wait a minute, it hasn't worked in the past. And you say, yeah, but listen to this. Listen to the logic. I know we've had failures with the transcontinental railroads, federally funded. I know we've had failures with the federally funded steamships and the fur trade. But the airplane is so important, it cannot be left to private hands. For example, you don't see anybody right now out there inventing it, but the French and the Germans and the British are all practicing and working on one. And if they get it built before we do, they can come over across the ocean, bring that airplane, drop bombs on us, and you people will still be there waiting for somebody to invent it. Why don't we be proactive, loyal to your country? Let's pick the most qualified person we can find. Give that person a subsidy. And then invent that airplane and defeat the Europeans. Wow. That argument was so powerful that we began to consider, who's the biggest expert? You see, you pick the biggest expert, the government does, you anoint them with aid, they invent the airplane, and the U.S. has an industrial triumph. The man we looked at to invest in this airplane money was a man by the name of Samuel Langley. He was head of the Smithsonian Institution. He'd written a book on aerodynamics. He had tested a model plane with a miniature kind of engine, and it went across the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. And the idea was he did a miniature version. He's written a book on it. He's an esteemed scientist. He had honorary degrees from Oxford, from Cambridge, from Harvard, and Yale. Why don't we give him the money? And then have him go through and follow through and invent it. And then the United States will be on top. Langley emerged came forward and said, I volunteer to receive this subsidy. Yes, I will be endowed with federal aid. And he was given enough for two to build his, he called it an aerodrome. Of course, we call it an airplane today. He was going to build his aerodrome for get 2 flights. He built it. Massive subsidies, even money from the Smithsonian Institution went into it. Langley built his airplane. He received his government money. And after building this airplane, after receiving his federal funding, he had a test flight. The first one, reporters all around in Washington, D.C. His theory, I might add, was this. He said the key here is speed. Because Langley said it's like an ice skater. You glide on the ice, but if it's thin ice, you're gliding on it successfully until you come to a stop. Then you fall in, if it's thin ice. He said a plane is like that. You shoot it real fast and it just glides along. Langley got in, and he did not have a runway. It was all from a gigantic catapult on a boat in the middle of the Potomac. The reporters were there. It was like a giant slingshot catapult, and it just went whoosh into the air. The pilot, whose name was Charles Manley, said, "Oh, the beauty of being free in the air." It was short-lived beauty. Soon he had a beauty rest in the ocean. The flight, and many of the commentators were quick to mention, it did not actually fly at all. It was just the projection of it, and then gravity pulling it down. And one of the people who was observing from the Washington Post, and I think it's good when the Washington Post says something useful to quote it. The Washington Post said, "Any stout boy of 15 could have skimmed an oyster shell much farther than Langley." And Langley said, well, Langley's response was this. He said, "Such failures are in no way, failures are to be expected. I am in no way affected by this accident," which is one of the large chapters of accidents that beset the initial stages of experiments so novel as the present one. We waited for flight number 2. 1903, December, flight number 2 came. The wintry day in Washington, D.C. The same pilot was back for more. He got in this thing, the slingshot, the catapult went back, and just flew off. Crashing into the Potomac River. Some people had comments that were considered cruel. The Boston Herald said, "Professor Langley needs to give up his idea of airplanes and try his hand with submarines." The New York Times, in its wisdom, made the following comment. Its reporter was on the scene, described the failure, and the New York Times editorialized that day, "Such flight is well nigh impossible in our time. We cannot expect it for perhaps another 1 million years." The New York Times estimate was off by 999,999 years plus 356 days. 9 days after the failure of Langley's second flight, the Wright brothers 2 unknown bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, with a home-built engine and $2,000 of their own money, made the first successful flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in December 1903. Yes, the sheriff of the Wright brothers. Remarkably, and people made that comment and said, my gosh, who would have ever thought they could have done it? We thought Langley was the guy. This is the point with the government subsidies. You can't pick winners and losers. As someone pointed out, they sure can pick the losers. I want to give credit where credit is due and read what the San Francisco Chronicle had to say about this. Are you ready? Yes. Here is word for word the San Francisco Chronicle. The destruction of Langley's machine should put an end to congressional appropriations of any kind in every field of experiments which properly belong to private enterprise. We should send that in and quote it back at them. If ever there was a quote that misproved the theory of evolution in a newspaper, it's that one right there. I tell you, that's what we had, and that made an impact on that generation. Just as the Transcontinental Railroad failure made an impact on that generation. Now here's what happened though, and it's important to grasp this. We understood the problem, and we didn't have federal subsidies again for these kinds of development projects for quite a while. We didn't teach that lesson to our youth. In fact, let me throw it open. How many of you, and then we have a very well-educated group here, I know in San Jose, we have Silicon Valley, we have people who are high-tech. How many knew the story of Langley versus the Wright brothers? Several. But not very many, frankly. I mean, I say several. I see about 10 hands. How many did not know it? I want to be honest, I don't know of any textbook, except possibly Larry Schweikart's Patriots History, that delves into the Wright brothers in any way. And if you see my point, if we aren't being taught the problem of federal subsidies and the failure of them, how can we expect a generation to come up and say, well now wait, this isn't a good idea? Because some of this sounds very reasonable. It sounds very reasonable to say, wait a minute, we have this educated guy. The Germans and the British are on our tails here. Let's give him a subsidy and let's catch up and make sure we're ahead of them. The study of history helps us very much with this. It helps at Hillsdale College. It's no wonder we have so many good things going. We take no federal aid. We get students who come in there and say, I'm ready to learn. I mean, I had a situation where it's kind of shocking. I said, well, one time I did a speech, I'm going to have to cancel class. Oh, no. I said, you know, Burt, you're not at State University anymore. I said, we need to, the students, they come in, we need to understand these concepts, and I think all of us do. We were remiss, many people were very patriotic in 1903, decided when the Wright brothers' story was told, they would tell the wonderful story of Orville and Wilbur. And it's a remarkable story. They were the sons of ministers, and they wore their coats and ties down there at Kitty Hawk, even when they were practicing their gliding for their flights. They were polite to the children. Everybody liked them. They never cussed. They never drank. We were talking about this earlier. They were original Tea Party people. They were considered crazy, and they ended up flying. And we told some of that story. We didn't tell the Langley part because a lot of people who had good intentions said, you know, that's kind of a messy thing. And it's kind of humiliating to Mr. Langley. Why don't we just slip that out and we'll tell a little bit about the Wright brothers. And we missed the point to educate. That's part of why we're trying to say, collect the stories, the heroes, the failures. And even I thought, you know, put this together and get this out. Now, when the Wright brothers failed, we have to go on because there's actually another step here. When the Wright brothers failed, they were there were original Tea Party people. And it's kind of humiliating to Mr. Langley. Why don't we just slip that out and we'll tell a little bit about the Wright brothers. And we missed the point to educate. That's part of why we're trying to say, collect the stories, the heroes, the failures. And even I thought, you know, put this together and get this out. Now, when the Wright brothers failed, we have to go on because there's actually another step here. When the Wright brothers succeeded, their first flight was less than a minute. And they took them a while, and they got so they could stay in the air for a couple minutes. And each year it got longer and longer until they could be in for a half hour. And they had a place at Dayton, Ohio. They'd fly in circles around the city. And so people could come and see them, but they would only be up maybe 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, 15. They worked their way up. And when they got it up to about half an hour, they said, now it's time, since the whole idea of the airplane was national defense. There are commercial possibilities too, but national defense is something very important. We thought, hey, let's take this and offer to sell it to the U.S. government for national defense. And we had Congress, should we buy this Wright? It was called the Wright Flyer. Should we buy the Wright Flyer, their airplane? Congress debated and ruminated over this. Should we buy the Wright's airplane? And I have a question for you. How many of you think the U.S. government, the fee, by the way, is $25,000 back then, bought the Wright's airplane? Wow, not very many. How many think they did not buy the Wright's airplane? An overwhelming majority said, no, they're not going to. In this case, the majority is correct. They said, we're not going to buy this thing. How do we know it'll work for us? It's expensive. How do we know you can really do it? We're here, I don't know about this. Newfangled stuff. We had a wild situation. The U.S. government refused to buy it. Well, they had to do something for defense. And so we had various people, the French government included among the people, groups here, who said, what you really need to do for national defense is buy a great big, gigantic balloon. A helium balloon. And you get in the air, and then, now I know the wind, it could blow you away from the battlefield and all that, but you get up there in the air with a big helium balloon, and then you go over, and then you can drop bombs on people. And so the balloon salesman came to the U.S. government to sell a balloon, and he said it's a lot cheaper than those Wright Flyers, too. And Congress deliberated what to do about this balloon. And I have a question for you. How many of you think they bought the balloon? Oh my goodness. A lot, a lot. Keep your hands up. Okay, how many think they did not buy the balloon? Okay, a few. An overwhelming majority of you say they bought the balloon. They didn't buy the Wright's airplane that could fly, but they did buy the balloon, is what you're all telling me. In this case, the majority is correct. They bought the balloon. Now, I have to report that the Wright brothers, for all their willingness never to cuss, drink, were sorely tempted at the decision that had been made. They decided to keep improving their airplane, and they did a double test. One before the U.S. government in Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C. And then they took the Wright Flyer over to Paris. Because they thought, if our government isn't going to buy it, we'll sell it to a foreign government. Which is weird, because the reason for the subsidy in the first place was to keep them from getting the airplane. Wilbur Wright flew for over an hour in France. And it absolutely dazzled the French people, who wanted to sign up right away. And Orville Wright did real well in his flight test in Virginia. And so it became apparent that the U.S. government needed to buy an airplane. And naturally, the Wright brothers' airplane was there. But we do have a second contender Langley, from the time his splight failed and the Wright brothers succeeded, he said they were lucky I had it almost all worked out. And I want another subsidy so that I will contribute the airplane. Langley said, and I wanted to quote this, yes. He was talking about this. He says, a cessation of these experiments at this point will be unfortunate. He requested $25,000 for, quote, a new launching apparatus. With some slight change, he said, I will fly for certain. Plus, he said, the Wright brothers are out for profit. He said he would donate free to the American people forever the Langley airplane. To give him the subsidy, it will fly and it will belong to all of America. He had been saying that since that, and we have people who stood up for him. Thus, when we are considering, should we buy a Wright airplane or should we buy the Langley airplane, we have a discussion to make at the U.S. government. And I have a question for you. They're going to spend $25,000. But of course, in today's money, that is considerably more. Are they going to spend it, however, on the Wright Flyer, or are they going to spend it on their Langley airplane? How many of you think, after careful deliberation, our politicians, so adept at picking winners and losers, how many think they picked the Wright brothers airplane to buy? Oh my gosh, this is the most cynical crowd I've ever seen. Nobody can be that skeptical. Shame on you. I want you to know something. You're all wrong. They bought the right plane. They bought the Wright brothers airplane. They did. They can get it right after a few mistakes. I tell you what, these stories are not in textbooks, and because they're not in textbooks, we don't get a chance to use them to teach children in the schools. We don't get a chance to teach adults in Congress and others who might benefit from understanding the misplaced incentives. The incentives gives you a chance, an opportunity to appeal to politicians for the subsidy. It gives the politician a chance to say, hey, I have somebody in my district. He can be a big help. Let's give him a subsidy. And then he gets the votes and campaign contributions from that person. Because we didn't teach these lessons in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, we passed a bill giving the Reconstruction Finance Corporation power to award subsidies independent of Congress. We had a flurry of subsidies. The Small Business Administration came in and did a lot of the same thing. Anita and I, in our book, we have a subsidy, a chapter on ethanol and green energy. Failed subsidies with ethanol. The tragedy. You know, Henry Ford was so sure that ethanol was the way to go. Corn produced. I mean, Henry Ford was eccentric. We all know that. He had a soybean suit that he would wear. And the idea, he thought the farm products have enormous benefits. And he built his engines, his internal combustion engines, so that they would take ethanol because he thought ultimately ethanol would win the battle for the cheapest fuel and most economical fuel. He built them that they could take gasoline too. And he said, well, what can I do? The market just continually says it's cheaper to produce that gasoline than it is to produce the corn ethanol. And so we're going with gasoline. It was a market-based decision. Ethanol may eventually prove to be competitive. There may be ways to do it, but the market is the place to work that out rather than with the subsidies. The tragedy, Dwayne Andreas at Archer Daniels Midland became so subsidizing both Republicans and Democrats with huge campaign contributions, and then Congress would pass bills that would create ethanol subsidies. You would get a huge amount of money and then would donate more money to campaign contributions. It reached a tragic point in 1972 when Richard Nixon was campaigning for re-election, and Dwayne Andreas comes in with this suitcase to the White House with $1,100 bills to secretly give to Richard Nixon. We just happened to find out about that on the tapes. And so on the Watergate tapes, that happened to be one of the tidbits that dropped into the conversation. And so we know that we open ourselves to that kind of politics. The founders were so insistent that we not go in that direction. But we did. What I'm hoping, when you look at Solyndra, we have a section on Solyndra, the failed government subsidies, that we can learn from the past. Some people have said, well, yeah, that's bad, but is it really that much money? That much money, let me put it this way. Failed government subsidies in the last 12 years, 2000 to 2012. We've had a recent report from an organization called Open the Books. It's an Illinois-based organization that has tracked federal subsidies. And we've looked at failed government subsidies, 2000 to 2012. During that time, if you look at all the money that was spent on government subsidies, it calculates to $3,000 a second. Every second from January 1st, 2000 to the end of 2012, the time period being studied. $3,000 a second. Every second of every day, of every week, of every month for the last 12 years. That's the kind of spending that creates the kind of debt that puts us in a situation where we can't give to our children and our grandchildren what was given to us by our parents. One way out of it, learn the truth. The truth is, related to subsidies, that they're more often than not an absolute magnificent failure. We've traced these. I'd like to have Anita. Where's Anita? Could come up.
I'm right here.
Anita, come on, help me give a book away. Anita and I co-authored a book on Roosevelt. First of all, did anybody vote right on every one of those votes? No! I can't give you a free book. We wrote this book. Go ahead, Anita. FDR Goes to War, New Deal or Raw Deal. Let's give these away. Why not two? Where's Sandra? Sandra McCorkle? Sandra, come up here. Please. Sandra teaches. I want to help a teacher. Do we have another teacher?
Is there another teacher?
Come on up.
Here. Man in the black shirt. And this is a copy of FDR Goes to War. We co-authored this, and it covers Franklin Roosevelt's presidency during World War II. And we show that many of the problems we have today actually began during the war emergency. This is David Barker. Where do you teach?
San Jose Unified.
San Jose Unified. Thank you. Thank you.
Anita's going to get me fixed up here. She said she's going to try. Okay. Can anybody have a subsidy for a microphone? No, it works actually very well. I'm the one causing the problem by moving around. What I'd like to do is take some questions from the audience. I have Anita up here with me. And hey, I'd be glad to talk about this issue with you tonight. And if you'd like afterwards, Anita and I would be glad to sign books. Uncle Sam can count. Questions? Yes, sir.
Langley Field.
Langley Field is named for Samuel Langley. They didn't give him the subsidy, but they named the field, at least a second subsidy, but they named the field for it. And that was to show the Wright brothers who the real originator was. Sure. Go ahead, Jerry.
We're going to have some volunteers in the aisle with cards so you can write your question down, and then they'll pick them up and we will look at them for legibility, comprehension, and variations on a basic theme of a question. So please bear with us. And I do want to say that Dr. Folsom said something about greedy profits. And one of his rhetorical questions is written as, is it greedier to make a profit or to tax that profit and spend it on a program to attract votes? Okay, questions are
All right, the card's being passed out now. I've got one to start us off here. I wonder if you could comment on the Manhattan Project in the context of your remarks tonight.
Yes.
Anita can comment on that. She really enjoyed studying. We both did, but Anita really wrote that section up in our book.
I worked with Burt on FDR Goes to War because that World War II and the time period before the war, diplomatic history in that period, is what I worked on in graduate school. So I wrote much of the actual military part of that book. But the Manhattan Project is something that we're frequently asked about. And as you know, that was the effort during World War II for the United States to build an atomic bomb. It was theoretical when it was begun. No one knew if it would work. But our concern was we thought the Germans were way ahead in building an atomic bomb. And you may not even know, but this is in FDR Goes to War as well. The Japanese had actually been experimenting with the same atomic principles and writing papers on it somewhat before World War II began. Now, after the war started, the Japanese had in no way had the natural resources to build an atomic bomb. But we were concerned that the Germans were already way ahead of us, so we poured $2 billion from 1942 until 1945 into building atomic weapons. And people always say, well, what about that type of subsidy? And that was a question that Burt and I had to deal with when we're talking about all of the problems that come from these government subsidies. How do you answer that? What do you say about the Manhattan Project? Well, one good answer is simply that the only time we can think of that a government subsidy could be a good idea is in a true national emergency. And those are very, very few and far between. Politicians love to drum up emergencies. We all know that. And I think the most current national emergency is global warming. And it's just ridiculous. It's mostly government-made, the entire crisis. But obviously in World War II, we did have a problem. And we didn't want the Germans to develop an atomic weapon, and we weren't sure about how far they were along on it. One reason that we would say in our book that the Manhattan Project was a success, and we think it was a success, we attribute two things. One, it was such a secret project. As you know, even a senator such as Harry Truman couldn't get information about the Manhattan Project. It was one of the few times a government project really was a secret. And it was so secretive that the political vultures didn't even know it was there. And they couldn't find it. And we think that made a difference. And the other part is the leadership of the Manhattan Project. General Leslie Groves, who's quite a character himself, if you want some interesting reading, was a very honest and patriotic American, and he led the project and we think did a good job. So the Manhattan Project is very, very much probably the one exception we would say to what we're talking about.
A genuine crisis, secretive, and high-quality leadership. And that combination did seem to work in this instance.
Can you comment on the heavily subsidized Tesla automobile and whether it can succeed?
That's what we're facing with today, isn't it? Edison would have liked that, because if Edison had received a subsidy, he would have gone with an electric car. And Tesla also, Elon Musk, is in many, he has elements of both, what I call a market entrepreneur, a political entrepreneur, but certainly that political entrepreneurship is there. And he did receive subsidies for the electric car, and it cost over $50,000. I'm not saying it can't ever be a marketable enterprise, but it ought to be done privately, because when it's done with subsidies, the history is that the receiver of the subsidies does things that make the project less effective rather than more effective. So we're likely to see a long time under a subsidized condition before an electric car will really be functioning really well and at a price that people can really afford. The subsidies are keeping it going. Yeah, that's a good question. The Tesla is not like the Manhattan Project.
Can you comment on the greatest subsidy of our time, Obamacare?
I want you to think for a moment. Anita described what was present that made the Manhattan Project work. How much of that is present with Obamacare? It's not an emergency, a national emergency. It's not a national emergency. It's something that can be worked through. It's not done in secret. It's not done with high-quality leadership. And this is what you see. Obamacare is much more typical than the Manhattan Project. But when you get instances like the Manhattan Project, it often gets people thinking, well, you know, maybe we can make this thing work. It's a series of special conditions that are absent almost all the time that made the Manhattan Project work, and completely absent in the case of Obamacare. And it's really very sad to see that in action. I guess the best hope, and Anita and I sometimes when we talk about this, we think maybe the best hope is that it serves as a dramatic example of how not to do health care. And then I keep thinking, but if it is, we have to make sure our children and our grandchildren learn it so that we don't have to go through the enterprise of Langley and the airplane and the Transcontinental Railroad. Keep going through them to learn from history and then apply that learning would really be helpful.
Is there a book on this subject that you would recommend written for children ages 9 to 14?
Educating children about these principles is very challenging, and there is a great deal more attention, we think now, on getting particularly economic principles are a little complicated to teach even to high school students, and we need some historians and economists to come along and write on that. Now, Burt has a book, Myth of the Robber Barons, that is a very easy read. And if you have a sharp high school student, they could certainly read Myth of the Robber Barons, and that gets across many of these principles. And that's been in print since for almost 30 years, Myth of the Robber Barons. It's available on Amazon, but there aren't very many, I'm sorry.
I have to say this, Anita and I, we were not exactly typical parents, I guess. Our son did his first term paper in the 3rd grade on James J. Hill, builder of the only private, Transcontinental, and the only one that really succeeded. And he remembers those lessons today.
What about NASA and the space program in the early years?
Yeah, a good question on that. NASA is interesting because it's fraught with political entrepreneurship. It's there in Houston because Lyndon Johnson was Senate Majority Leader when Sputnik came on, right? And so immediately we get the subsidies into Houston. Now, we have launched many successful flights, and it makes you wonder the alternative, what could have been done with other alternatives. For example, if we had a prize or something. Charles Lindbergh, when he flew across the Atlantic, he didn't do that with a subsidy. He did that because he was awarded a prize for the first person. It was interestingly, that figure's come up several times. It was $25,000, which in today's money would be $500,000. The average person earned about $1,000 a year, and the prize was $25,000. So when Lindbergh made that transatlantic flight, he won the Orteig Prize, which carried with it $25,000. That created the incentives without costing the government a whole lot, because the person who put the money up was a private individual. It wasn't government money. Now, you have to look at the space program. An alternative line might have produced something even much better. We've had some disasters. Some have been good, too, because we've managed to employ, they managed to employ the right people. It wasn't a situation of, oh, good, we got a subsidy, let's bring in Langley to build our rocket. Right? In other words, we actually got people in there who knew what they were doing quite a bit of the time. That usually doesn't happen, but NASA has had some victories.
You see some of the subsidy problems with NASA, though, in that movie Apollo 13, because when they had the disaster on board the rocket going to the moon, they don't have standardized parts, and the parts in the lunar module don't fit the main spacecraft, if you remember that part of the movie, and they have to improvise things with duct tape and socks and all sorts of parts. They should have had standardized features in both. And that shows you a government subsidy. One company got a subsidy to build a lunar module, and another company got a subsidy to build a rocket. And that was a problem. So.
Are there any countries or societies that you would say have learned these lessons better than we have?
Ooh, that's a good question. I guess the French were clever. They sold us the balloon and bought the Wright flyer. You know, one thing that's interesting is the United States has done very well. I would hesitate in this area of invention and entrepreneurship to put any other country as a whole up. They've had individual moments of glory, the English have, for example. And they helped invent penicillin. You know, they've had some remarkable inventions. But the United States has had that tradition of limited government. And that rugged kind of American tradition, which was part of the first settlers out here to California that you still see sometimes, that you go, my gosh, we can do this, and we're going to have limited government, and I'm going to invent something, and I'm going to accomplish something. And that entrepreneurship combined with the limited government has given the United States more than its share of entrepreneurs. I found teaching at Hillsdale College, I estimate that about 1 out of every 50 students that I come across is incredibly gifted, just naturally gifted, in the area of entrepreneurship. By that I mean, the person doesn't necessarily know where he or she wants to go to invest or invent, but they have that kind of creative, risk-oriented mind. That willingness they get excited over the idea of ideas and inventions, what can be done, the willingness to persevere. And I keep thinking that may be true with the population, about 2%. What we do with that 2% of the people, do we stifle them with high taxes? In our book, FDR Goes to War, we find the tax rate at 94%. Yeah, at the end of World War II, 94% on all income over $200,000. The improvements with television, I mean fast food, motels, the ballpoint pen, a lot of Xerox machines, all of those came after World War II, after we cut the tax rates. After we cut the tax rate. The corporate rate we cut from 90 to 38%. Those rates got cut, and then the 2% who have those abilities, and others do too, I don't want to just say everybody else doesn't. People are inclined in different ways to have qualities of entrepreneurship, but those people who seem to be gifted in that area, you're in effect turning them loose, saying, you get to keep what you make. And the United States has done a better job with that, not because we're superior people, but in a way we are an exceptional country. We are. We're exceptional because we have freedom, and we've been willing to turn people loose and say, what can you accomplish with your freedom? And we have had a lot done.
Amen.
That is encouraging. The thing right now that concerns me the most is that no longer is the United States so free in terms of its tax policy. Many countries have much better corporate tax setups than the United States. And what discourages entrepreneurs and investment are these ruinous taxes that suck all the life out of the economy. If you think about it, in the 1930s during the Great Depression, what inventions can you think of that were highly developed? That we point that out in our book, FDR Goes to War. That's one reason the United States was so behind at the beginning of World War II. The taxes promoted by Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s had sucked the life out of the economy, and inventors were not developing their ideas, not very often. And if the United States keeps up these ruinous taxes, that's what hurts entrepreneurs.
This next question pertains to a related era of the United States. Can you please discuss the rationale for the Department of Agriculture and farm subsidies under FDR?
I'll start that and Burt can finish it. I mean, that began under Franklin Roosevelt, and the book that Jerry Mungai was mentioning that Burt wrote with the Morgenthau quote, New Deal or Raw Deal, Burt has an entire chapter on the Department of Agriculture. And that was an idea, not of Franklin Roosevelt, but of a college professor. Many of those farm programs.
It was an idea so ludicrous, it could only have been conceived by a college professor. And it was a Harvard economist, Professor Black. And the idea is, if farmers are in trouble and they're not getting getting a lot of money for their crops, then what you need to do is pay them not to produce. And if you pay them not to produce, it'll have a positive twofold effect. It will increase their income, and then also it will take crops out of circulation and thus naturally raise the price. Well, now that is well and good, I suppose, for the farmers receiving the subsidy, but what about the rest of us buying bread? We have shortages all of a sudden in a time of Great Depression and skyrocketing bread prices when people are on bread lines trying to get some food. It really had terrible unintended consequences. What's interesting is the way the Republicans responded. In 1936, they nominated the governor of Kansas to oppose Roosevelt, and he said, "This AAA is stupid," and he got, "Stupid! This dumb, pay people not to produce. Pay me not to produce." Well, it turned out they did. Well, anyway, he was sitting there, pay people not to produce. That's foolish. And so he was getting applause. And so Roosevelt said, "Okay, is he going to take away the farmer's subsidy? Are you going to take away the farmer's subsidy?" And the farmer said, "You're going to take away our subsidy?" It's a deer in headlights moment. No, we'll just do it better than they do. In other words, we'll administer the AAA better than the Democrats. And so then the question at the ballot box is, do you want to vote for a Democrat who invented this subsidy, or do you want to vote for a Republican who will manage it better? The end result of that election, as many of you know, was Franklin Roosevelt, 523 electoral votes. Governor Landon of Kansas, 8. Yeah.
All right, this next question must have come from a masochist. They want you to share with us what was the largest subsidy in our history.
The largest subsidy in our history. Well, at the time, the Transcontinental Railroad, which was the entire national debt in the 1860s, was at that time. You would have to prorate this into current dollars, and that would still be up there. Cylindra is up there too, by the way, but not the largest.
The Manhattan Project was $2 billion in 3 years,
Yeah.
which is a lot.
That's a good question. This is one of those masochistic questions. Write down the top 10 biggest disaster subsidies. Yeah, let's think about that. Thank you.
The educational system is entrenched. How can the word get out on a more massive scale to make a difference?
Boy, that's a good question, isn't it? And I'm open. We have teachers, we have others in here. At our end, what we're trying to do is get out good information. But that isn't all there is to it, is it? You then have, how do you get this information out on a wide scale? I was on the Texas Textbook Commission for one term. It was over 10 years ago when we lived in Texas. And that was an interesting experience because it is much harder than I ever imagined. The California Commission is also very, very difficult. I think the best answer to one of the answers to this is through charter school decentralized education. The more we get decentralized education, what's going to happen is we're going to get districts where you'll see what works. What's being put out that really makes a difference and gets good learning on the part of students. There will be people copying that, and inevitably, the good ideas that are out there in many areas are going to proliferate as good and better schools come about. I know it seems difficult. I'm looking around, in whose lifetime? There are movements afoot, and I wouldn't be surprised in the next 10 or 15 years if we do see more of a collapse of a lot of public, I'm thinking of teacher unions in particular. Thank you. I think that answer, it gets a lot easier when we have a more decentralized school system. In a centralized school system where the textbooks are picked by people who don't have sympathy to freedom and liberty, makes it very, very difficult. But I don't think that's beyond victory. I just think we're going to see the bigger victory down the road for that.
And I think one thing that can be done is to really point out to the parents the tragedies in these school systems are the children of these low-income parents and the parents who desperately want an education for their children. And they don't have the money to go to the high-priced private schools, or they don't have the personal resources, or you have the single moms, and so they are sending their children into the public schools. One thing is to point out to them, and here's an example that we've watched unfold. We spend about half the year in Atlanta, Georgia, because that's where we do our writing. Our son lives down there, and the other half of the year we're in Hillsdale. Well, in Atlanta, Georgia, a few years ago, their superintendent of the Atlanta Public Schools, a huge school district, was a female who was Dr. So-and-so, and she was getting phenomenal results in the Atlanta school system. It was touted all over the country. Did any of you read about that? Atlanta was just great. And it was touted all over the country for the results this superintendent was getting. What was she doing? And then, of course, what did she do? She eventually, a few years after all this wonderful success, she took a high-priced job as the head of the school district in Houston, making even more money. Well, it turned out, somehow or another, the word finally got out that what was happening was this superintendent had gone to the principals in her district. And, of course, it was standardized testing. And she said, I want your students passing those tests. I don't care what you have to do. I don't know how this superintendent did this. This has been virtually proven. The principals went to their teachers and did the same thing. And the teachers, some of the teachers, not all of them, and I tip my hat to teachers every day who are working hard and doing the right thing and trying to be honest. But dozens of teachers in the Atlanta public school system had what they called erase parties. And the teachers would meet at other teachers' houses, check the test score sheets from all these standardized tests for these high school students, erase enough of the wrong answers to make the test work, and then say the high school students had passed. And so these students are being funneled through the Atlanta system, and they are the victims, and their parents are the victims. And how much attention have you heard on the national media about this fiasco? Well, you hear it in Atlanta because the parents are outraged. They were told their children were educated. They were told their kids were passing, making B's and C's on these standardized tests, and they were not. And now their kids are in college, and they can't do it. Some of them can barely read. And this superintendent was recalled from Houston. Houston got rid of her. She was indicted. Many of the high school teachers have been indicted. Several have been found guilty. And I don't think the superintendent is ever going to come to trial because now she has stage 4 cancer, and she's probably dying. But all of these kids are out here, 19, 20, 22, 24 years old, and they have no education. I'm just saying, let's tell them, you are the victims. You are the victims. And if you don't ask for accountability from these teachers and from these systems, you are going to be the victims. And Hillsdale College has a program now to open more and more charter schools, and we're opening one in Atlanta. And we will have applications out the door of parents trying to get their children in those schools. And they are not high-priced schools. that's where I think you can find a good private school and help them get the price down on tuition.
Can you comment on the United States Postal Service and proposals to privatize it, especially in the context of competitors like FedEx and DHL?
Yeah. Oh, that's been wonderful, but we finally been able to innovate in postal service because the post office received a monopoly late in the game. Mail was not originally a government monopoly. That happened right before the Civil War. Became a government monopoly, and of course we had lots of inefficiencies, and so finally we had FedEx, UPS, were able to penetrate part of the market and have been very competitive. So the package market is really, the post office is a minority player in many of the packaging. And they have federal funding. They get their buildings built for them. They have the post office, the mailbox system, all of that. And the others are very, very competitive. It shows what can happen if we privatize parts of the post office and we have improvements. You get competition. I can remember when we did that for the first time, I saw that guy behind the counter at the post office smile. It was always funny because when I was teaching back in Kentucky, we had the post office was near the McDonald's. And one of my colleagues who had a lot of sense said, if you want to see how government operates and private enterprise operates, go into the post office and get served, and then go to McDonald's and get served. Well, since then, we've had the UPS and the FedEx, and we have seen some improvement. A good example of privatization producing an improved result.
Is it true that the submarine and torpedo were invented in the United States, refused by Congress as being of little value, and sold to France?
I'm sorry, I didn't get all that question.
The submarine and the torpedo.
Oh.
We don't really know a huge amount about the torpedo, but the submarine, I'll tell you one of the things we do have in Uncle Sam Can't Count, which is the book over there, is we have a chapter on Robert Fulton and the steamboat and Cornelius Vanderbilt, as Burt has mentioned. And how many of you were taught in school that Robert Fulton invented the steamboat, and it was named the what? The Claremont, and it chugged up the Hudson River. How many of you were taught that? Most of that is false. His boat, and we mentioned this in our book, was named actually the North River. That's what people in New York, that region, call the Hudson River. That's the lady down here is nodding, the North River. And he wasn't the first person, Robert Fulton was not the first person to put an engine on a steamboat. A man named Fitch in Delaware did it before Robert Fulton. And Fitch was just considered this wide-eyed maniac because he put this steam engine on a boat and everybody thought he was crazy. And Fitch tried to make a profit by sailing it up the Delaware River. The only problem is the banks of the Delaware are extremely flat. And he would have his steamboat going up the Delaware River, and the stagecoaches of the day would pass his steamboat. And who wants to go on a slow boat up the Delaware River when you can get on a stagecoach and go twice as fast? So Fitch went broke very quickly. But Robert Fulton, now he really was, I'm sad to say, he was very much a political entrepreneur. He worked the political system. And to get back to the submarine, he had actually tried to develop a submarine when he was in Europe. Robert Fulton spent 20 years in Europe, and he tried to sell Napoleon his plans for a submarine, and Napoleon wasn't interested. So we're not really experts on the whole history of the submarine, but we do touch on that part. But Fulton was a no-go with Napoleon. So then Robert Livingston, actually one of the founders, talked Robert Fulton into coming back to New York and setting up a steamboat line. So we do know about that.
Back in the 1980s, there was a lot of attention and anxiety about Japan and its industrial policy, especially relative to the technology revolution at the time. Can you comment on that?
When I was in the 1980s, that was supposed to be the wave of the future. Heavily government involvement in various programs, Mitsubishi, so on. You get a tremendous. I think we can see the last 20 years. Ultimately, that has failed. Japan is bankrupt. It has huge inflation rates. It's really very sad to see what has happened in that country.
And I think that may be all the time we have for questions.
Thank you.